The rancher was riding with his bride, and froze when he saw his pregnant ex-wife carrying firewood. The morning should have been simple, just a quiet ride down the ridge with the man who had chosen her when no one else even bothered to look. But as Mara sat sideways on the saddle, her new husband's arm steady around her waist, she felt the old fear curling inside her ribs like a memory trying to claw its way out. And she tried to push it down, tried to focus on the creak of leather, the smell of dust warming under the sun, the steady rhythm of Rhys Calder's horse beneath them. She had married him only a week ago, still learning his silences, still startled every time he tilted her chin with a tenderness she'd never been offered before. And today he'd insisted they ride into town together. Let folks see you're safe. Words he had spoken in that low, even tone that made her believe he meant it, even when the world had taught her the opposite. But halfway down the trail, Rhys's body stiffened beside her, a sudden tension that made the horse slow, and when she followed his gaze toward the split rail clearing below, she saw a woman bending under the weight of a bundle of firewood, pregnant belly heavy, hair tangled, dress torn at the hem, moving with the stubborn determination of someone who had stopped expecting help long ago. Mara didn't recognize her at first, but Rhys did. She felt it in the way his breath caught, the way his hand on her hip froze mid-motion, the way every muscle in him went rigid. And the cold realization slid through her chest when he whispered a single name, barely audible, almost reverent, almost pained. The woman turned, wood threatening to spill from her arms, and though her face was gaunt and wind-burned, Mara saw it, a history etched between them, something old, something bruised, something unfinished, and she felt heat rise in her throat, not jealousy at first, but confusion, then a sharp sting of humiliation as the woman's eyes widened at seeing Rhys on horseback, with a new bride seated in front of him like a quiet proclamation that life had moved on for him, even if it hadn't for her. A gust of wind scattered dust across the clearing, and the pregnant woman flinched, clutching her belly protectively as one log slipped from her grip and fell into the dirt with a dull thud. Instinct moved Mara first. She shifted to climb down and help, but Rhys caught her wrist gently, not in refusal but in something else, something like fear, something like guilt. And for one suspended moment Mara felt her heart fold in on itself, felt the old shame she thought she had outrun creeping up from the past. He slowly dismounted, lowering Mara to the ground with care before stepping toward the woman he once called wife. And Mara watched the scene unfold like a public judgment she hadn't agreed to stand in front of. Rhys reaching to help the fallen wood, the woman jerking back in wounded pride, the air thick with a tension that had nothing to do with Mara, yet clung to her like dust on her wedding dress. And in that breath, that awful, fragile breath, Mara understood the one truth that would define everything that came next. She was not the only one in this story who had been abandoned, not the only one carrying a past she never asked for, and not the only woman who had once stood before Rhys Calder, hoping he might stay. Rhys didn't sleep much that night, though Mara pretended not to notice the way he lay awake beside her, staring into the dim cabin rafters, while the quiet of the prairie pressed against the walls like a question neither of them knew how to answer. She rose before dawn, as she always did, slipping from the quilts and pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, the cold boards creaking softly under her bare feet as she moved to the stove, grateful for something to do with her hands, grateful for the simple rhythm of stacking kindling and striking flint, because her mind was still tangled in the moment she'd seen his ex-wife's face, the hurt in it echoing louder than anything Rhys had said, or hadn't said. When the flame took, a small stubborn glow blooming into warmth, she felt her breath loosen, just enough to remember where she was now. Who she was now, and she set the pan down, pouring the batter she'd mixed the night before, pretending the steady sizzle was enough to drown out the doubts clawing up her throat. Rhys finally rose, boots in hand, moving quietly so as not to startle her, though she'd learned by now that he moved quietly even when there was no reason to. He leaned against the edge of the table, watching her with that unreadable stillness of his, the kind that made her feel seen but never judged. And he murmured her name, a soft, low sound that carried more apology than explanation. Yet she kept stirring, kept her gaze on the skillet because she didn't know what to do with the tenderness in his voice. Not after seeing the way his breath had broken at the sight of the other woman. Not after feeling his hand freeze on her waist like he'd touched a memory. Not her. But when he stepped closer, stopping just behind her, the warmth of him folding over her cold shoulders like a silent offering, she felt the shake in her own breath give her away. And she hated that he heard it. Hated that she still felt so breakable, so easily cracked open by a kindness she didn't know how to hold. Rhys reached around her, slow as sunrise, taking the wooden spoon from her hand. Not to correct her, not to take over, but to steady the tremble she couldn't hide. And when she let him, when she didn't pull away, something in him softened, something like relief flickering over his face before he exhaled quietly against her hair. "Mara," he said again, firmer this time, and she braced herself for whatever truth he thought he owed her. But instead he set the spoon down and wrapped a thick wool blanket over her shoulders, tucking it in the way a man does when he's afraid of losing something fragile. The gesture shouldn't have undone her. The blanket smelled of cedar and smoke, ordinary things, but the gentleness of it shattered the dam inside her, and she found herself pressing a hand to her mouth as the tears came. Not from jealousy or fear, but from the shock of being treated as if she mattered. She sank onto the bench, shoulders shaking under the warm fold of the blanket, and Rhys knelt in front of her, the morning light catching in his unshaven jaw, his eyes steady and unflinching, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment to show her who he really was. "You're safe here," he said, simple as a breath. No promises he couldn't keep. No explanations about the past he wasn't ready to speak of. Just that one truth he wanted her to believe. And when she finally lowered her hand and met his gaze, still trembling but no longer numb, she realized the question that had circled her mind all night had shifted into something gentler, something she almost dared to trust. Why is he this kind to me? Rhys saddled the horses in silence that afternoon, the kind of silence Mara had begun to understand wasn't avoidance, but caution, like he was choosing every breath before it left his chest. And though she tried to match his calm, her palms kept sweating against the worn leather reins, because today they were riding toward his world. Not the quiet ridge where his cabin stood, not the creek where she washed their clothes in cold, forgiving water, but the settlement where his people traded, repaired tools, shared news, and carried stories of the past like open wounds. She felt small riding behind him, the wind tugging at the ends of her braid, her mind replaying the moment she'd seen his ex-wife's pregnant form and the unanswered ache in Rhys's eyes, an ache she wished she didn't notice. But she couldn't stop it from lodging deep inside her ribs. The trail narrowed, and soon they were passing 2 riders coming down from the higher slope. Men from Rhys's circle, men who didn't hide their surprise at seeing Mara riding with him, one of them raising a brow, the other smirking in that cruel, familiar way that made her stomach twist. "So the quiet cowboy found himself a bride," one of them drawled, gaze sliding over her like she was an object to be assessed, not a woman already fighting to breathe through her own past. The other snorted. Was the ridge running short on prettier choices? The words hit her like old blows, mockery she thought she'd outrun. But Rhys didn't snap, didn't punch, didn't even stiffen. He simply rode closer to her, placing himself between those men and her horse, a silent, unbroken wall that made their smirks falter for a heartbeat. But the damage was done. Her face burned, shame climbing her throat the way it always did when people weighed her worth out loud, and she swallowed hard, wishing she could disappear into the saddle. Reese's friends continued down the trail, laughing under their breath, and Mara thought the moment was over, until Reese dismounted without a word, lifted her gently off the horse, and guided her under the shade of a cottonwood tree, where the breeze softened enough for her to breathe again. He didn't touch her at first, just stood there, hands resting loosely at his sides, eyes studying the dust at his boots, as if gathering the courage to speak. When he finally looked at her, there was something raw in his expression, something she hadn't seen before. Not even the night he'd knelt beside her after the wedding and told her she didn't have to prove anything to him. "Those men," he began, voice low, unsure, "they know too much of my past, and they don't know you." Mara felt her throat tighten, not from hurt, but from the strange softness behind his words. And before she could speak, he reached inside his coat and pulled out something wrapped in a strip of tanned leather, a small carving knife, handle worn from years of use. "My father gave me this when I was 14, he said quietly, offering it to her, not pressing it, not insisting, just offering. Said it was for when the world tried to make you smaller than you are." Mara stared at it, at the history etched into the grain, at the weight of something he'd kept close to his body for half his life. And she felt an unexpected crack form inside her chest, the kind that wasn't pain but recognition. Recognition that Reese Calder was showing her a piece of the wound he carried, one he never spoke of. Her fingers trembled as she closed them around the knife, the cool handle warming against her palm, and she whispered, barely audible, Maybe ugliness wasn't the real problem." Reese's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in a grief so old it seemed to echo through the shade around them. And when he finally exhaled, it was the gentlest breath she had ever felt. The settlement came into view just as the sun stretched long shadows across the ground, the scattered cabins and fire pits glowing in the evening light. And Mara felt her pulse quicken at the low hum of voices drifting through the air. Children laughing somewhere behind a corral, women grinding maize, an elder humming a prayer that carried the weight of memory. Reese stayed close beside her as they led the horses through the narrow path between the lodges, his steady presence the only thing keeping her breath from tangling in her throat. But for a moment, as they passed a row of drying hides, the toe of her boot caught on a loose stone, and she stumbled forward with an awkward gasp. Before she could hit the ground, Reese's hand shot out to steady her waist, pulling her upright in one swift, firm motion that left her pressed against his chest, her cheeks burning because the women nearby paused their work to watch. With curious eyes, amused eyes, some warm, some calculating. And Mara braced for the laughter she'd known all her life to follow such clumsy moments. Instead, one of the children, barefoot, smiling with a gap in his front teeth, burst into a giggle, and another joined. And then, surprisingly, Reese let out a soft breath of laughter, too, the kind she had never heard from him, low and unguarded, and so warm it drew a startled smile from her before she could stop it. The women exchanged glances, some whispering with mild interest, but no one mocked her. No one sneered at her awkwardness, and the simple mercy of that made her eyes sting in a way she didn't understand yet. Reese didn't release her right away. His hand stayed at her waist a moment longer than necessary, his thumb brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress, as if he needed that one last touch to anchor himself. Before he guided her toward the central lodge, where an elder sat on a woven blanket, her silver hair braided with strips of dyed thread, her expression sharp enough to cut through even Reese's calm composure. The elder, Nalin, lifted her chin as they approached, eyes sweeping over Mara from boots to braid, lingering long enough to make Mara's stomach twist again. "This is the woman you bring into our camp?" Nalin asked, voice dry as desert wind. "Thin, frightened, carrying ghosts like a storm cloud?" Mara felt the judgment like a slap, her breath hitching, but Rhys stepped forward, his broad frame blocking the elder's line of sight. Not aggressively, but decisively, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to speak aloud what he had only ever shown through his actions. "She is my wife," he said, voice steady, carrying farther than he intended as several nearby heads turned. "And she is under my protection, because she has known more cruelty than any of us should allow." A hush fell, not hostile but startled, as if Rhys had revealed a piece of himself rarely spoken. Nalin's eyes narrowed, studying him, studying Mara, weighing the truth in Rhys's tone. And after a long, uncomfortable stretch of silence, she looked away with a dismissive huff. "Protection is easy to offer, harder to keep." The words stung, but Rhys didn't flinch. Instead, he reached back, fingers brushing Mara's wrist, grounding her with the smallest of touches, a gesture so intimate in its quiet reassurance that her chest tightened around it. She understood then. This place, this people, this elder, they all carried their own wounds, and she was stepping into a world that required more than survival. It required proof of worth, proof of belonging. Rhys glanced at her, a soft question in his eyes, and for the first time since arriving, Mara didn't avert her gaze. She held it, steady, as if telling him silently that she knew now how much of his own brokenness he had been showing her all along. The light had just begun to dim into the cool blue of early evening when the commotion started near the edge of camp. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the sharp whinny of a horse that didn't belong to anyone in Rhys's people. And Mara felt her stomach tighten as she and Rhys turned toward the noise. Two young hunters jogged past them, calling for water and blankets. And when Rhys moved to follow, Mara stayed close behind, her fingers brushing the back of his sleeve for courage, until they reached the small clearing where a white settler woman lay slumped against a half-torn saddlebag, her skirts ripped, face dust-burned, ankle twisted at an angle that made Mara's breath catch. The hunters stepped back warily, uncertain how to handle someone who clearly came from Mara's old world. And the injured woman, upon seeing Rhys's broad frame and dark hair approach, recoiled with a frightened gasp, dragging herself backward through the dirt. "Don't touch me! Please! I'm not here to cause trouble!" she cried, voice trembling, eyes darting between Rhys and the other villagers, as if expecting violence in every shadow. Mara's heart clenched because she recognized that fear, the same fear she had once been taught to feel toward Rhys's people. And for a fleeting moment, shame crawled up her spine, hot and suffocating, remembering all the lies she'd once believed simply because someone older had spoken them with authority. Rhys knelt anyway, slow and deliberate, palms open, showing no threat. And though the woman flinched again, he didn't retreat. He examined her ankle with gentle, practiced movements, jaw tightening only when she winced. "It's swollen, not broken," he murmured, more to the hunters than to her. "She needs water and rest." But the woman wasn't listening. Her gaze had locked on Mara, widening with a kind of desperate relief. Are you safe?" she asked, voice cracking. "Did he take you? Did he force?" Mara flinched as if slapped, the old shame surging, words tangling in her throat as the villagers stiffened around them, some offended, some weary, some simply tired of hearing lies that never seemed to die. Rhys didn't speak, didn't defend himself, didn't correct her. He simply shifted closer to Mara, not touching her, but placing himself between her and the accusation, a quiet shield that said more than anger ever could. The wounded woman, confused by his silence, hesitated, then whispered, "But you're with him. Why?" Mara swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing on her, the judgment from both worlds choking her breath. But before she could answer, before she could find the voice she had been slowly reclaiming, Rhys reached into the small pouch at his belt, pulled out a handful of crushed herbs mixed with warm fat, and spread it gently along the woman's swollen ankle. "The world isn't divided the way you were taught," he said, his voice steady, calm, carrying the soft authority of someone who had lived too long in the shadow of prejudice to waste breath arguing with it. "Pain is pain. Help is help." The woman blinked, stunned by the simplicity of his words, and something loosened in Mara's chest. Not because the outsider understood him, but because Rhys had spoken aloud the moral code she had only glimpsed in his actions. Yet, even as relief flickered through her, Mara felt a hollow ache forming inside her ribs, a reminder of just how much of her old world still clung to her skin, refusing to wash off. Rhys finished binding the ankle, rose to his feet, and without looking at Mara directly murmured, "Come. We need to move before night falls." She followed, but the shame trailed after her like a shadow, whispering that she belonged nowhere, not in the world she'd come from, and not yet in the world she was trying to enter, until Rhys's fingers brushed hers for the briefest second, steadying her steps in the quiet, unspoken way only he ever did. They left before sunrise, following a narrow trail that led toward the army outpost 5 miles east. Rhys carrying the settler woman on his horse, Mara riding close behind, the camp's quiet eyes watching them go as if already sensing the danger waiting up ahead. And though the air was cool, Mara felt sweat gathering at her temples, her mind churning with dread, because every mile they rode pulled them closer to the world she had once known too well, a world that measured worth with skin, accent, clothing, and birthright, a world where men like Rhys were judged before they spoke, and women like her were ignored until needed, then discarded. By the time the wooden palisade of the outpost came into view, high walls bleached pale by wind and sun, Mara's heartbeat had turned into a thud that shook through her ribs. The sentries spotted them quickly, rifles slung casual but eyes sharp, and when Rhys dismounted to lower the injured woman into Mara's arms, the soldiers didn't look at the settler's torn dress or swollen ankle. Their gaze snapped straight to Rhys, shoulders stiffening, hands tightening around rifles as if a man offering help was somehow a threat. "Step away from the women," one barked, striding forward with a swagger Mara remembered too well, the kind of authority that didn't need truth to justify itself. Rhys lifted his palms, slow, open, calm, always calm. But the gesture only made the soldiers tense further, as if peace itself offended them. The injured woman tried to speak, tried to explain, but her voice broke, and the moment she faltered, the lead soldier shoved Rhys back with the butt of his rifle, the force jolting through his ribs. Mara gasped, instinct dragging her forward, but another soldier blocked her path, hand raised to silence her without even meeting her eyes. "He brought me here," the woman cried finally. "He helped me. He saved—" "Ma'am, you're frightened." The soldier cut her off, briskly. "We'll handle it from here." Handle it. Mara had heard those words before, spoken by men who believed the truth existed only on their side of a badge. And her skin crawled as 2 soldiers grabbed Rhys's arms, twisting them behind his back with unnecessary force, jerking him toward the holding shed as if restraining a criminal. Rhys didn't resist. He stood grounded, jaw tight but gaze steady, meeting Mara's eyes across the open yard in a way that made the world slow for a breath. A silent message passing between them. "You needed to see this." Mara tried to push forward again, words clawing up her throat, but a 3rd soldier stepped into her path, gentler but still dismissive, positioning himself like she was a misunderstanding they'd sort out later. "Miss, you're safe now," he said, giving her shoulder a condescending pat that made nausea rise in her chest. "We'll get you back to your people." My people? The phrase hit her like a slap, because these were the same kind of men who had looked away when she'd been mistreated, who had whispered about her plainness and laughed at her missteps, who had only ever seen her when she was convenient to blame or ignore. The injured settler tried again to defend Reese, but her voice was drowned out by orders barked across the yard, boots clattering on packed dirt, men dragging Reese toward the shed, while he kept his eyes on Mara with a calm that terrified her more than anger would have. Because he wasn't pleading, he wasn't panicking, he had expected this, lived this, survived this. Her breath stuttered as the shed door slammed shut behind him, a metallic thud that echoed like a verdict, and the soldiers turned back toward her with relieved smiles, as if they had restored order instead of breaking something sacred. And in that moment, standing between two worlds that had both failed her in different ways, Mara felt something inside her crack open, not from fear, but from fury so sharp it steadied her trembling. Reese wasn't the danger here. The system was. And for the first time in her life, she saw it clearly. The outpost buzzed with careless confidence the next morning, soldiers laughing over tin cups of coffee, a blacksmith hammering horseshoes, a clerk shouting inventory from the supply shed. Yet all Mara could hear was the echo of the door slamming shut on Reese the night before, the dull metallic thud replaying in her skull until it felt like a bruise spreading behind her eyes. She hadn't slept, pacing the cramped visitor quarters the soldiers had assigned her, eyes burning, mind racing with every moment she'd witnessed. The mockery on the trail, the injured woman's fear, the smug relief in the soldiers' voices as they claimed they'd handled it. She stood at the window now, watching the holding shed across the dusty yard, the boards weathered and splintered, a crude lock hanging from iron brackets, and she realized with a cold, steady certainty that Reese Calder had been right. She needed to see this, needed to see how easily the world dismissed men like him, needed to see how blindly it welcomed women like her back into its fold, provided they remained silent, grateful, compliant. But she wasn't silent now. Not inside. And certainly not grateful. Footsteps approached in the hallway, boots too heavy to belong to Reese, and when the door swung open, it was the officer from yesterday, the one who had patted her shoulder like she was a frightened child, holding a ledger and wearing a tight, polite smile. "Miss," he began, clearing his throat as if preparing to perform a duty he didn't quite enjoy. "We've made arrangements to escort you back to town shortly. Your companion will be released once we've confirmed there was no wrongdoing." Companion. Not husband. Not protector. Not the man who had carried an injured woman across miles of rough trail. Just companion, said with the clipped tone of someone who'd already decided the shape of the truth. Mara turned from the window slowly, her voice rough from disuse. "Wrongdoing? He saved her." The officer's smile tightened. "Sometimes those people pretend to help." "Those people?" The words shot from her before she could temper them, sharper than she intended, cutting through the stale air between them. He stiffened, adjusting his stance. "Miss, I understand you may feel sympathy." "Sympathy?" she whispered, incredulity rising like heat. "You haven't even spoken to him." The officer blinked, taken aback by her tone, and for a moment Mara saw it. That tiny flicker of confusion men like him felt when a woman they expected to obey suddenly didn't. He recovered quickly, though, straightening his shoulders. "Ma'am, we're simply following procedure." Procedure. The word tasted like rust. Procedure had allowed her father to neglect her for years. Procedure had let gossip define her, mock her, break her, until she believed she deserved nothing better. Procedure had taught her that quiet compliance was the only protection a plain woman like her was allowed to have. But Reese had never asked her for compliance. He'd asked her to be honest, to be brave, to look. So she stepped past the officer without waiting for permission, skirts brushing his polished boots, her breath shaking but her spine impossibly straight as she crossed the yard toward the holding shed. Soldiers watched her, confused, curious, dismissive. She ignored them all. When she reached the shed, she lifted the latch with trembling hands and pushed the door open. Reese sat on the dirt floor, wrists bruised from the rope they'd used before locking him in, hair hanging loose around his face, but his eyes, lifted to hers with an unbroken calm that made her chest seize. "You needed to see," he murmured, repeating the words from yesterday with a quiet certainty that settled something turbulent inside her. For the first time, she didn't look away. "I did," she whispered. "And now I know." He tilted his head, studying her carefully, and she saw the question forming before he spoke it. "What will you choose, Mara?" The choice sat between them like a live coal, dangerous, illuminating, impossible to ignore, and as the shouts of soldiers echoed distantly behind her, she realized the answer wasn't a question at all. It was a promise. She would not abandon him. Not now, not ever. Night fell over the outpost with a heavy, breathless stillness, the kind that made every lantern flame look sharper, every shadow longer, every footstep too loud. And Mara waited in the thin sliver of darkness behind the commissary shed, her fingers trembling inside the sleeves of Reese's coat. He had insisted she wear it before dusk, pulling it around her shoulders with a soft, steadying touch, as if preparing her for what they both knew would come. They had no weapons, no allies, no guarantee that the soldiers wouldn't shoot first out of pride or fear. But there was one thing they had. A plan born from Reese's quiet observation and Mara's sudden, fierce refusal to let the world define either of them anymore. She watched the sentry pace the catwalk above the yard, counting each pass under his lantern until the moment he paused to relight the wick. Reese had told her the flame sputtered every night around this time, a weak patch in the oil mixture, and while the guard leaned over the railing to shield the flicker from wind, his line of sight toward the ground disappeared. "When that happens," Reese had whispered inside the holding shed as she worked the rope knots from his bruised wrists, "you lead, I follow. Lead, not hide, not obey. Lead." She repeated the word in her mind like a heartbeat as she stepped from the shadows, skirts brushing the dirt in silent urgency, her breath tight but her resolve unshaken, and she crossed the open yard with the knowledge that if she hesitated even once, if she faltered for even a heartbeat, Reese would be dragged back inside that shed before dawn. The lock on the shed door gave way under her hand. Reese had already weakened the hinge earlier with the tip of the old nail he'd pried from the floorboards, and when the wooden plank shifted, he emerged silently, tall and steady, his posture low but unbroken. The brief moment where his eyes met hers under the moonlight, dark, warm, fierce with trust, felt like a vow forged without words. Together they slipped toward the corral, where the horses were tied. Reese moved to untether them, but Mara raised a hand, stopping him. "Let me," she breathed, glancing toward the guard tower. Reese hesitated, then nodded, watching her closely. Her fingers fumbled only once before finding the right knots, and she worked quickly, loosening the ties on not 2 but 4 horses as Reese had instructed, creating just enough disorder to confuse the soldiers about how many had been taken. A dog barked from somewhere near the stables, a sharp warning cry, and for one terrifying breath the outpost seemed to hold still. Reese placed his palm lightly against her back, not pushing, just anchoring, his breath brushing her ear. Now. They mounted in near silence, the leather creaking barely louder than Mara's racing heartbeat, and the moment they turned the horses toward the narrow gully along the outer fence, a lantern flared on the catwalk. "Hey, who's there?" a soldier barked, rifle raising toward the yard. Rhys pressed his heels gently to his horse, urging it forward, but Mara was already moving, tugging her reins sharply as she took the lead. Guiding them down the slope toward the shallow ravine Rhys had found during supply runs years ago. Shots cracked through the darkness, panicked, impulsive, wide of their mark, echoing against the wooden walls as the horses tore through sagebrush and dust, hooves pounding against packed earth. Mara's braid whipped behind her like a tether, pulling her away from the life she'd once known, and when the ravine widened into open land, Rhys rode up beside her, eyes full of something like awe. Not fear, not doubt. Awe. They didn't stop until lantern lights faded entirely behind them, and the night grew thick with quiet. Only then did they slow, breathless, shaken, alive, approaching the small homestead of an older man Rhys trusted, an uncle in all ways but blood. The elder stepped outside with a torch, eyes sharp but welcoming. "You were found," he said softly, looking first at Mara, then at Rhys. And in that moment, dust on her dress, windburn on her cheeks, Rhys's coat heavy on her shoulders, Mara realized with aching clarity that she loved him not because he had saved her, but because he had seen her, believed her, and let her choose. Dawn rose sharp and gold over the elder's homestead, washing the valley in the kind of light that made every color look honest, every shadow look smaller. Yet Mara felt no peace in it, only the tightening coil of something inevitable, something she sensed in the restless twitch of the horses, in the way Rhys kept glancing toward the ridge as if expecting movement, in the elder's quiet pacing as he whispered a prayer under his breath, and when the first dust plume appeared, a thin smear rising from the far edge of the prairie. Mara knew before anyone spoke that the soldiers had found their tracks. Her pulse hammered painfully in her neck, but she didn't step back. She moved closer to Rhys, close enough that the warmth of his arm brushed her sleeve, close enough that she could feel the way he steadied himself. Not for battle, not for anger, but for whatever choice she would make now. The elder watched her with a knowing sadness, as if he had seen this moment before in others who'd been forced to stand between two worlds. And when the riders crested the slope and formed a line of blue coats across the ridge, Mara felt the old dread claw at her ribs. But it was no longer strong enough to move her feet. Rhys touched her elbow lightly, guiding her behind him, but she shook her head, stepping forward until she stood at his side instead. His jaw tightened in protest. The lead soldier, the officer who had spoken to her with that polite, suffocating condescension, rode ahead of the others, rifle resting across his saddle, voice carrying easily. "Miss Mara, step away from that man," he ordered, tone firm but almost relieved, as though expecting her to cling gratefully to the authority he believed he represented. "You are not safe with him. We'll take you home." Home. The word struck her like a brand, not warm but burning, because she suddenly understood that home wasn't a place she'd been born to, or a room she'd slept in, or a town that had stared at her plain face and found her wanting. Home was where she was seen without condition. Home was where someone's first instinct was to protect her without owning her. Rhys shifted beside her, muscles coiled, ready to meet the soldier's anger with calm defiance. But she reached for his hand first, fingers sliding into his with a certainty that made his breath catch. And then she stepped forward, placing herself clearly, undeniably at his side. The soldier stiffened. The officer's brows snapped together in disbelief. "Miss, what are you doing?" Mara's voice trembled once, then steadied in her chest. "I am standing with my husband." A murmur rippled through the line of men, confusion, irritation, disbelief colliding in their expressions, and the officer tried again, louder. "He is dangerous." "No," Mara said, louder still. "You are." The words hung in the air like a strike, sharp enough to make several soldiers exchange uneasy glances. She stepped forward another pace, her hand still gripping Reese's, his thumb pressing back in a silent vow. And she spoke not just to them, but to the system that had mocked her, silenced her, ignored her pain. "He carried your injured woman for miles," she said, voice raw. "He treated her ankle, gave her water, brought her to you because he believed you would help. And you threw him into a shed like an animal because you were afraid of the truth." The officer scowled, cheeks reddening. "You don't understand how things work." "I understand exactly," Mara replied, "and I'm done pretending I don't." One of the younger soldiers shifted nervously in his saddle, eyes darting between Reese's calm stance and Mara's trembling determination. "Sir, maybe we should listen." "Quiet," the officer snapped. But the shift had begun. Mara could feel it in the air, see it in the way some soldiers lowered their rifles slightly, uncertainty cracking their rigid posture. She stepped closer to Reese, lifting her chin. "This man is my choice, my partner, my husband." And then, quiet, steady, unshakable, "I am not going anywhere without him." A long, brittle silence stretched across the valley. Then, slowly, the officer signaled the retreat, fury simmering in his eyes, but outnumbered by the doubt in his own ranks. The soldiers turned their horses, backing away, dust rising around them. And when the ridge finally emptied and the open prairie lay still again, Mara let out a long, shaking breath and tightened her fingers around Reese's hand, feeling his quiet pride settle through her like the first warmth of morning. Weeks passed, like a long exhale after years of holding her breath, and Mara found herself learning the rhythms of the small homestead the elder had opened to them. Mornings spent sweeping cool dust from the doorway, afternoons hauling water from the creek with her skirts damp around her ankles, evenings sitting beside Reese under the warm hush of twilight as they shelled beans or mended tack, their hands working quietly while the world softened around them. Every day brought its own small proof that peace wasn't something grand or sudden, but something built out of repetition, like the steady scrape of bristles on the cabin floor, or the way Reese tied his hair back before the day's work, or how he always paused at the same moment each evening to look toward the ridge, as though checking that the world hadn't shifted beneath them. Mara carried her own changes quietly, too. She no longer flinched when her reflection appeared in the water bucket, no longer saw the plain, unwanted girl her father had told her she was. She saw steadiness now, a softness that wasn't weakness, a clarity in her own eyes that no longer averted themselves from truth. And though she thought often of the pregnant woman carrying firewood on that day that had altered everything, the sting no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like a closed chapter. No revenge sought, no bitterness held, just the acceptance that hurting people left wounds behind them, and she had survived hers. Reese rebuilt the small barn with the elders' help, their laughter carrying across the yard some mornings when the beam slipped or the tools went missing. And Mara found herself smiling at the sound long before she realized it, warmth settling through her chest like sunlight after rain. She tended the small garden behind the cabin, coaxing life from stubborn soil, and for the first time, she believed the life growing there mirrored her own. Slow, quiet, rooted. Some evenings the elder would join them for supper, settling into the chair by the hearth with a satisfied sigh as Mara set down the bowls, his eyes glinting with approval, not only for the meal, but for the way Mara and Reese moved around each other with unspoken understanding. "Peace looks good on the both of you," he would say, and Mara would duck her head. But Rhys would only glance at her with that quietly proud half-smile that still unraveled her heart. But the moment that sealed itself into her bones, etched as deeply as the first time he'd steadied her at the settlement, came on a cool morning near the creek, mist curling low over the water as she knelt to scrub laundry on the flat stones. She had been lost in the rhythm, humming to herself softly, when a shadow fell across her hands. She looked up to find Rhys standing there, holding a folded blanket, the same thick wool one he had wrapped around her shoulders on their second morning together, the one that had broken her open in ways she hadn't been ready to understand back then. He unfolded it slowly, stepping behind her, draping it around her with the same quiet reverence, the same gentleness, the same unspoken promise. You matter here. Her breath caught, eyes stinging as she pressed her fingers into the warm fabric. And Rhys knelt beside her, forehead leaning lightly against the side of her head in a gesture so tender it stilled the world around them. You're home now, he murmured, not asking, not hoping, just naming the truth she had already begun to live. Mara closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the blanket, the steadiness of his breath, and the soft rush of the creek braid themselves into the kind of memory that doesn't fade, but settles deep and sure. And for the first time in her life, she believed it fully, without hesitation, without shame, without fear. She was home because she had chosen him, and he had chosen her quietly, fiercely, without condition. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had been there, would you have stepped in like he did? Tell us in the comments.